continent of Atlantis was an island which lay before the great flood in the area we now call the Atlantic Ocean. So great an area of land that from her western shores those beautiful sailors journeyed to the South and the North Americas with ease in their ships with painted sail. To the east, Africa was a neighbor across a short strait of sea miles. The great Egyptian age is but a remnant of the Atlantean culture. The antediluvian kings colonized the world. All the gods who play in the mythological dramas, in all legends from all lands, were from fair Atlantis. Knowing her fate, Atlantis sent out ships to all corners of the earth. On board were the 12, the poet, the physician, the farmer, the scientist, the magician, and the other so-called gods of our legends. Though gods they were, and as the elders of our time choose to remain blind, let us rejoice, sing, dance, and ring in the new age. Hail Atlantis!
Like a child who's running wild, sinking deeper down the line. I close my eyes to see the light. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be. Way down below the ocean, way down, where I wanna be, she may be. Like a child who's running wild, sinking deeper down the line. I close my eyes to see the light. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be.
My antediluvian baby, I wanna see you someday. I wanna see you someday. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, way down
Below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be.
Is James Tyberonn. And his subject is the crystals of Atlantis, and after break it will be the vibrational stones for health and spirituality. Now, I was particularly pleased when I called James to have a conversation about his biography because he shared with me a very special story that sounds like many of ours. He said that he was, at one time when he grew up in Arkansas, a born-again Baptist. He became a geologist and for many years traveled the world. And on one occasion, he happened to be on the Amazon River when he encountered a German man who was an engineer who was laden with books for him, had books to share, because down there, of course, television not being something they enjoyed watching, they loved to read a lot of books. And guess what one of the books was? One that brought many of us to the Edgar Cayce work. Yes, There is a River. So James read There is a River from cover to cover, and from that day forward was what I call a born again and again Christian, rather than a born again Christian. He has since been on the spiritual and metaphysical path, so he is thrilled to be here finally to what he calls home. And if you've been up in our meditation room of late, you will see a beautiful lapis lazuli that he donated just this year. It's magnificent and so powerful. So that was a gift from James. Go up and experience it. And he promises he may bring yet another stone to the A.R.E. So, James Tyberonn worked as a professional engineer and a geologist for 33 years. As a geologist, he had the opportunity to study the Earth from every continent. He has circumvented the globe many times and traveled to over 85 countries in his geology work. He was recently privileged to be invited to the United Nations to speak for their SEAT conference as a featured speaker. As a musician, Tib produced and recorded a music CD of blues and jazz, and all of the proceeds from the CD are donated to charity, the Foundation for the Cure of Cystic Fibrosis. Tib, as he's called lovingly by friends and those who know him, is a member of the Sierra Club and a staunch environmentalist. He has a great love for the planet and believes the Earth to be a living sentience of Gaia. He has visited over 300 sacred sites across the globe. He has authored 4 books, co-written a 5th with Lee Carroll and Tom Kenyon, and is writing his 6th book now on the metaphysical healing properties of gemstones. He has learned firsthand what he teaches. He walks his talk in humility and gratitude, and his goal is to merge the scientific and the spiritual, forming the integral circle. Please join me in welcoming James Tyberonn.
Thank you all very, very much for coming here and for the lovely welcome. And before I begin, I would like to give credit to this wonderful organization. As Ellen said, it's my first time here, but what an amazing place. I mean, the warmth, the heart, the spirituality just exudes from here, and you can truly feel the spirit of Edgar Cayce. And as Ellen mentioned, I was on the banks of the Amazon River when I read There Is a River, and it just and it was just an astonishing experience for me, because I had been raised by a very spiritual family in Arkansas. My grandfather was a Baptist minister, my father was a deacon, and most of my uncles were deacons, and we went to church every time the doors were open. And I felt guilty because I didn't always enjoy it, and I couldn't quite relate to the idea that if you didn't ask to be saved, you'd be burning in hell forever. And so I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. And so I ask every night, and but never truly had that experience of answering the questions that I had inside. And when I read that book, it did. And I had that absolutely extraordinary experience of literally walking on clouds for 3 or 4 days in the Amazon. And those of you that have never been to the Amazon, I was past the point where the Rio Negro and the Rio Amazonas come together at an extraordinary place called Manaus. I was 300 kilometers north of there, and that's an area where the purple dolphin are. Some of you may not be aware that a violet-colored dolphin actually exists in the Amazon River. And the location that I was in, the river was 13 kilometers wide, about 100 meters deep. And at night, or right around the evening time, the dolphins would come up. So I wasn't sure at first if that was just part of the experience I was having after reading the book, or if it was a real experience, but it was both, in fact. There are purple dolphins that swim in the Amazon River, an extraordinary experience. But back to the A.R.E., I want to acknowledge that book written by Thomas Suger changed my life, and it was the life of Edgar Cayce, the fact that he had so much integrity in the struggles, and the fact that he went through something of the same experience that many of us as Christians had when we become aware of a greater reality, a greater truth. And so I could relate to his experiences as I read it. And then when I got into the part about reincarnation, about laws of cause and effect, about soul's purpose, it was like 1,000 lights lit up inside my heart. It was like the experience my parents said they had when they were saved, that I never quite had. I had it when I read this truth. And so I owe a great debt to Edgar Cayce and to the people here at the A.R.E. that lead this organization. I want to mention Charles Thomas Casey. I had the opportunity to meet with him at his home, extraordinary hospitality. And I also want to acknowledge John Van Auken. I believe that John is one of the most extraordinary teachers on the planet today. He truly is someone I consider a mentor, a shining example. And John invited me here to speak. I'm very grateful for that, but more than that, I'm grateful to John for the person that he is. So another round of applause for John Van Auken. Okay, so I'd like to get started on the presentation, and I'm going to do two today. The first one, of course, is the story of Atlantis and the crystals, and the second one is about healing gemstones. And so I often tell people that my life makes more sense in retrospect than it did when I was going through it. I was born in Arkansas, and Arkansas is, and a lot of you may not know this, and I'll tell you that Arkansas is the largest deposit, singular strata deposit of quartz in the earth. And so I was born in the crystals. And then as soon as I finished my university, I moved to Brazil, which is the other largest deposit of quartz crystal on the planet. So I spent a lot of time in that quartzian piezoelectric energy. And while I was in Brazil, right after, in fact, that my colleague gave me the book about Cayce, the Brazilian government made a decree where any foreigner working in Brazil had to receive a high percentage of their salary in the local currency. At that time in 1978, it was cruzeiros. And when I went to Brazil, 6 cruzeiros equaled $1 US. When I left Brazil 7 years later, 22,000 cruzeiros made $1. So you could not take cruzeiros and put them in the bank. When you came back, there was nothing there. And so Brazil is an absolute cornucopia of gemstones, of crystals. And so a lot of people in Brazil bought gemstones with their money because they held their value. And so right about the time I was reading about Cayce and getting into Cayce's information on gemstones, which is a lot of my second presentation, I was also having to buy gemstones. And so I had the rare experience of having to learn about gemstones, and then I've got a photograph taken 35 years ago of me sitting at my dining table with my landlord, who also sold gemstones, with literally piles of amethyst, opals, imperial topaz, aquamarines, everything you can imagine, emeralds. And it was just an extraordinary experience because and I'll talk more about this in the second hour, I had the experience to really learn about them in great detail. So that'll be the second hour. So we'll go ahead and get started on the story of Atlantis. So the capital of Atlantis was described by Plato as being an absolutely beautiful city surrounded by 3 concentric canals. And Edgar Cayce speaks about a golden age of Atlantis, as does Plato, that was a time of great beauty, a Camelot, it was a utopia. Cayce said that during the golden age of Atlantis, that the Atlanteans reached the highest level of spirituality ever achieved on the planet. Now that's an interesting point, because so many people in the quote-unquote new age of metaphysics consider that Lemuria was actually a higher spiritual resonance, where Cayce says what was achieved in the golden age of Atlantis by all of you here, Children of the Law 1, was actually the highest. Now I'm going to talk a little bit differently. John gave a fantastic presentation on the crystals of Atlantis, or was contained in there a couple of days ago. And much of mine is similar, coming from the same readings, but with a different perspective. And so I'm going to talk about that, some different interpretations a little bit that I'd like to share with you on that. How many of you here felt like you were in Atlantis? And it's about half of the people. Cayce said about 70% of the people on the planet had lifetimes in Atlantis. And he also said before his death that Atlanteans were coming back in by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and that they would have some important decisions to make and would also bring some incredible innovations and discoveries in terms of science that would upshift our time almost to that of what the Atlanteans experienced. And so the golden age of Atlantis was a time of great beauty, a time that was a Camelot, and it is, as I mentioned, a time in which we had to make some decisions, and it ended sadly for us. And we have an opportunity in this lifetime to perhaps correct some of those. I mentioned earlier the capital of Poseida was surrounded by canals. Now it's interesting that there was a book written in the early 1900s by a Dutch author that talked about Atlanteans coming into Holland, and I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. But I've been to Holland quite a few times, and it's an extraordinary metaphysical community. And I've taught the Metatronic keys there a few times. And what's interesting about Amsterdam is that it is also a city with concentric circles. And so there's an energy layering that occurs there. And they are very, very free-willed people in Holland. They absolutely preserve their liberties and their joy of life. And so Amsterdam is one of those places that I think absolutely has a lot of the children of the law of one. There was beautiful architecture of temples, theaters, parks, universities, and the golden era of Atlantis was a land flowing in creative literature. It was a really, really happy time that a lot of us associate with the energies of Lemuria. It was a time of great artistic expressions. They had all of the amenities and more than of what we have today. There was absolutely all the convenient methods of travel that we have, including airfare, boats. They had the subterranean crafts. They had television, theater, music, recordings, films. Someone yesterday in one of their presentations mentioned Ruth Montgomery. How many of you are familiar with the work of Ruth Montgomery? She's passed over now, but she was quite an interesting author. And she spoke a lot about Atlanta. She did a reading, actually. She was semi-celebrity. She had been a journalist that covered the White House for NBC News for a number of years. And she was close friends with Johnny Carson. And she stated that Johnny Carson had been a television host similar to the way he was in this life in Atlantis. And so that was quite interesting. But the fact is they had television, they had theater. And it's sad, but we think of Atlantis now in a sense of sadness, a sense of regret, a sense that it was a terrible society. And it was not. The law of one, again I want to stress, which most of you were part of, was absolutely a spectacular, harmonic group. It was a very special time on the earth, and as Cayce said, they achieved the highest realm of spirituality ever achieved on the planet Earth by mankind. Now, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about what I think some of the interpretations of the Cayce readings are that I have that may be somewhat unique. And so we'll come to that. I just want to establish this groundwork of what that society was like. And they did indeed use crystals. They had an incredible array of crystals, crystals that powered all of the machinery, crystals that were used to raise the energy of universities that could be directed into institutions of higher learning to upshift the sense of well-being. They had crystals that could control the weather. They had crystals that could power everything, much in the way that Tesla was working on the free energy at the earlier part of the 20th century. And so it was a time of that highest energy, And so at this point, I want to start at the beginning. So our dynamic Earth has been in existence for about 4.6 billion, with a B, years. This is what they call Pangea. How many of you are familiar with the Pangea supercontinent? The idea in geology is that about 264 million years ago, all of the continents of Earth were collected together, were one big continent. And through tectonic movements, through polar shifts and other geological slow dance phenomena, all of this changed. The Appalachian Mountains just north of here are absolutely the same mountain range that occurs in Scotland, where they're referred to as the Cairngorm Mountains. Did you know that? No. Absolutely the same. They separated here, you can see that. Ireland, time of Pangea, was attached to the Sahara Desert of Africa. And so that's very different. And if you've been to both Scotland and Ireland, there are some notable geological differences. Magnetic pole reversals have taken place on the planet many times. Our sun, in fact, is having a polar reversal right now. How many of you are aware of that? The sun reverses its magnetic poles every 11 years. And if it's energy right now where things are sluggish, where it's hard to really get moving, part of that may be because the sun is halfway through its flip. One of the poles on the sun is not putting out the anionic energy that it normally does, and the cationic energy or positive energy is not coming in as well. So we're kind of in a little bit of a flux right now. Have you felt that there's something going on? The sun reverses its poles every 11 years, and it's going to happen any week now. It's been ongoing since about the end of August, and it should complete itself soon. And then things will get a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more normalized. But we are in the center right now of a solar pole reversal. And so the Earth has had, over the past, over 103 of these. Now this is different from an axial tilt. A magnetic flip simply means that the anionic charge that is normally on the North Pole moves to the bottom, and the positive charge on the bottom moves to the top. One of the predictions that the Hopi had was that when the ascension occurred, when the new Earth came in 2012, that the sun would rise in the west. How many of you have heard that before? Well, and a lot of people have suggested that we're due a magnetic pole shift. So if the magnetic poles had have shifted, the sun would still be rising over the Atlantic, but that would be the west. So that's a very interesting thing to think about and consider. That's true if you think about it. Okay, to move a little further, I told you that our Earth is 4.64 billion years old, and 500 million years ago, something very, very special called the Cambrian period occurred, and it's generally referred to as the Cambrian radiation or the Cambrian explosion. Does anyone know why? Anyone want to share that? The reason is because all life as we know it appeared on the planet 500 plus million years ago during the Cambrian radiation. Now, if you think that the Earth is 4.64 billion years old and that there is no evidence of life before life as we know it before 500 million years ago, that's a pretty interesting thing. And so what geologists and scientists believe is that the Cambrian explosion was earmarked by massive solar activity. Coronal mass ejections like the ones we've been experiencing in the past 2.5 decades took place there. And during that time, all life as we know it suddenly appeared in a short geological time. All the mammals, all the major fish, all of the fossil records began about that time. Greg Braden was the first one to talk about the coronal mass ejections, about all of the solar activity that has been bombarding our planet since 1989. How many of you are familiar with the ongoing rush of energy from solar mass ejections? That is something that Metatron refers to as the Aquarian shift. Susan Joy Renison. There are a series of Russian scientists that have spoken about it. But NASA has documented the number of X-class solar flares that we have had, and there have been studies that are suggesting that our own DNA is shifting. You heard John Van Auken speak yesterday morning about Cayce predicting a fifth race that would come in this century. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this presentation. But the scenario is there for our shift, for our evolvement. How many of you believe that the ascension took place on December 21st, 2012? How many of you believe that it did? I do. But it was not the ascension of humanity. It was the ascension of the planet. What I believe occurred on December 21st, 2012 was that the earth expanded into 12 dimensions. And that humankind will follow in about 15 generations. Obviously, if you look around now, we're not an ascended race. Humanity is far from being even in harmony. There are wars taking place, there is greed, there is controls, there are all of the things that we need to work out, but something did change. On December 21st, 2012, I believe a new grid came into place. And I believe that it is a crystalline grid, not the magnetic. And that it shifted us into 12 dimensions. And that is the matrix that will allow us to move into the ascension of humanity. And so this Cambrian age has a commonality with us, because all of these suns coming down, all of these solar energy rays, these anionic charges have shifted the atmosphere in our Earth. John spoke yesterday about the four creations of the Akasha, about the first and second interjections of Lemuria into the motherland, and then the first inclusions, the first excursions into Atlantis at about 210,000 BC, about 200,000 years ago. And as I mentioned, John shares that Cayce predicts a new body type will emerge in the new millennia, which will be the fifth race adaptation. We are currently carbon-based physical bodies. Dr. Carl Sagan, who is the author of Cosmos, how many of you are familiar with Carl Sagan? Extraordinary guy. And he used to be on the talk show circuit quite a lot. He suggested 30 years ago that if there is any other element capable of sustaining our biology, it would be silicon, which is the base of quartz crystal. Because carbon is a four-valent, in other words, it has four connections into compounds necessarily to sustain our life, and silicon is the only other one that is capable of doing that. And I'll tell you just an interesting story about Sagan. Sagan, you may remember the Dick Cavett show. Carl Sagan was quite the darling of the talk shows for a while, and he went on and he gave a really nice talk about the planets at the end of it, and he was particularly talking about the rings of Saturn, and he asked Dick Cavett if he had any questions or concerns, and Dick Cavett came back very quickly and he said not about Saturn, but that he had some concerns about the gaseous clouds around Uranus. So he was pretty quick on his feet there. And so this is what I think the ancient world looked like in the time of Atlantis. Cayce describes it as being about the size of Europe and the Middle East. And this would have been before any of the breakups around 200,000 years ago, where you can see that it basically touches North America, South America, Africa, and up into Europe. This is what I believe Lemuria looked like during that time frame. And not really spoken about in the Cayce readings, but mentioned in others, and the Metatronic readings is the continent of Rama, which extended from Madagascar up to Sri Lanka and almost to the edge of Western Australia there. So that's an interesting piece that I added into this as well. And so Cayce speaks about mankind coming onto the earth 10.5 million years ago. And as you heard John speak about, the original entries were in spirit form. They were not physical beings. They were projected thought forms. And so how many of you saw that with John the other day when he was speaking about the 4 entries? Well, so I want to focus my talk then a little bit on some pieces of the Cayce readings that I've taken and added some interesting evaluations that are a little bit different. But the timelines of Atlantis are 210,000 years ago for the influx of the original souls. Cayce said there were 133 million. 200,000 BC when Amelius came in as the leader of the Law of One, and I do think we are all part of that soul group. And here's one of my injections. 106,000 BC is the first Eden. And up until then, Cayce speaks that we did not have true physical bodies, and we were not gendered. We came in as androgynous spirit beings. In 50,000 BC, the first breakup where Atlantis goes into 5 islands: Poseidon, Arion, Og, Atalia, and Air. 28,000 BC, it breaks up into 3, Poseidon, Area, and Og, and the final breakup around 10,500 BC. And this comes from John Van Auken's article that I want to credit him for, The Origins of Mankind. If you do not subscribe to John's Living in the Light newsletter, I highly recommend it. It is available online, and it is just a treasury of information. I'd also like to mention at this point that we also have a newsletter where we share information at least once a month. If you'd like to sign up for our Earthkeeper newsletter, the forms are in the back to the side there, and we'd love to have you sign up with us. Okay, now this is something interesting that I'd like to share. The Atlantean crystal, all of you have heard of the big terrible fire crystal. There were other crystals that we're going to talk about, but the fire crystal was the one that Cayce spoke about as leading to the final destruction. The Atlantean energy machine described in the Edgar Cayce readings was called the terrible crystal, or Tuawe stone. Now, interestingly, there's a verse in the King James Version of the Bible in Ezekiel 1:2 that reads as the following: "And the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creatures was as the color of the terrible crystal stretched forth over the heads above." So there's evidence there that even in the writers of the Bible, that they were aware of 2 things. Of course, the terrible crystal that was probably responsible for what we think of as the Great Flood of Noah. But something else is really, really interesting here, and that's the reference to the firmament. The firmament plays a big role in some of the readings that we receive from Metatron. In reference to the firmament, Metatron readings indicate that it is pre-duality Earth in which the firmament existed. In other words, if we consider the Earth now to be a planet of duality, and it is, we have a North Pole, a South Pole, we have light and day, we have male, female. We are a planet, we are a consciousness living on a plane of duality. Does that make sense? If, according to Metatron, the firmament was a grid that surrounded the Earth before the planet became one of duality, and that during these times that John talks about, that Edgar Cayce speaks about, in which souls enter the earth plane, and they entered without getting attached to anything. These first souls that came into the earth came in as pure thought. They weren't male or female, and they were able to experience the elements and all of the existences down here without any quote-unquote karma. It was a playland. It was an adventure land. And the reason I suggest that many of you now have an association to the Däniken of waters, of airs, of trees, of plants, the flowers, is because, as Cayce suggested, as Cayce mentioned, when we first came down here, we experienced expressions of the elements. So we may have expressed ourselves as a tree. And Cayce also saw fairies and gnomes and elves since his childhood, and he explained those as conscious projections of trees, of minerals, of the sky, of the waters, the Däniken kingdom. So when we first came in, we experienced life by projecting our energies into the Däniken, into the elements, wind, fire, water, earth. And it was just an interesting expression. And then it started changing a little bit. John talks about Cayce A.R.E readings where they said they were getting caught into different situations that entrapped them and that they couldn't get out of. It is my belief, based on the Metatronic readings, that at that time, when Cayce talks about a group coming in to find a way out, the firmament fell. The firmament was a grid. How many of you understand what a grid is? A planetary grid. The firmament was a planetary grid that was replaced by a magnetic grid. Now, we have a new grid now that I was mentioning that we call the crystal grid. I refer to grids, particularly this one, as Windows 2012. It's simply a program that allows you more utility. You remember the old DOS programs we had before Windows came in? Grids are like that. They come in with different applications and with upshifts. And so the firmament allowed for a non-polar, non-duality Earth. And you may say that's not possible. It is absolutely possible for a sphere and even an octahedron to be non-polar, to be non-magnetic. And so I think that we had a unipolar or a non-polar firmament that allowed people to come in. And then what I think happened with the duality Earth beginning around 106,000 BC in Atlantis is that the magnetic grid came in. It was a dodecahedron. Plato described the Earth of that time as being a ball with 12 patches, which is what a dodecahedron is. And John talks about I believe it was a third Eden by that time. But the Adam and Eve story, if you think about it, is a metaphoric, symbolic sharing of the duality experienced. God reaches into the side of Adam and pulls out the other side, and the Latin word, the Greek word is kote, not rib, and it pulls out, it's the other side. So before that, we were not male or female, we were both and neither, and we came into a duality Earth as male, female. Does that make sense? Before that, there really wasn't a right and wrong, there really wasn't a pattern. So we come into the duality experience, we eat the apple of what? The tree of knowledge, and so suddenly we become aware of dualities. This may be right, this may be wrong. And so that is that experience. The Kundalini representing the forces that we will deal with in physical, more dense bodies, in which we're required to blend the lower chakras with the higher chakras, which is in essence what the Christ consciousness story of King Arthur is about, if you think about it. That's another topic. So what I'm suggesting is the firmament was the end of non-duality Earth, the beginning of duality Earth, and that duality is not a punishment. I'm suggesting to you that duality is a university, that we come here, we chose. Cayce spoke about not every soul choosing to come back. I suggest that duality is about learning creatorship. Metatron says that we choose duality to learn how to be a more responsible creator. Cayce says we don't go to heaven, we grow to heaven. But earth is a choice. And so we come to the University of Duality, the University of Earth, to learn through a great teacher, a teacher that makes house calls called cause and effect. And we learn how to perfect our lifetimes moving forward. And so that, I think, is the interesting aspect that I'd like to add to Atlantis, that I think duality occurred not during Lemuria. So those of you that think Lemuria had this utopian, wonderful time, they did, but they weren't really responsible for it. That's all there was at that time. It was a uni-world. There wasn't really a right and wrong. There were just experiences. It is in duality that the true earth that we know began, and our lifetime of cause and effect, our lifetime of lesson began 106,000 years ago. So life in the Atlantean eras began as light manifestations. We came in as aspects of the elements before Atlantis went into duality. And we had life entries into the animal kingdom as well. Cayce talks about that. There were extraterrestrial projections and manifest forms of extraterrestrials. I think a lot of the people of the Law of One came from the Pleiades. And so that's a very interesting point as well. The golden race of Poseidon were 10 to 12 feet tall, and Cayce talks about that as well. There were dwarfs and midgets, perhaps what we think of in literature as hobbits, that were 2 to 3 feet in height in the area of Poseidon. A lot of these were used in the mining concerns. The red races and the Aryan races began in Atlantis. The Aryan race was, I believe, genetically perfected. Or Cayce speaks about the Temple Beautiful, or the Temple of Sacrifice, where there were original manifestations of humans into bodies that had scales, tails, feathers, and all sorts of distortions, and these were purified out. Edgar Cayce, in the story of Atlantis, which I reread very, very recently, speculates that it was genetic engineering that the Atlanteans did to create the Aryan race, to remove these scales, these feathers, these appendages. And he also speculates that the Greek mythological figures, the minotaurs, the centaurs, the half-man, half-goat, half-horse, etc., were products of genetic engineering. Metatron verifies that in the readings and says that we created in those times animalistic beast with a mixture of human DNA and animal DNA to serve as labor, to serve in the military, and that one of these that was relatively successful is what we now call Sasquatch. That Edgar Evans Cayce talks about the possibility, and this is back a few years ago when he wrote this book, that these beasts that Cayce called robots, autotrons, abominations, were controlled radially, meaning with some sort of radio wave. In the Metatronic readings, it is said that the Sasquatch and Yeti originally did have some sort of genetic implant that prevented them from having a very high IQ, kept them at the animal level. And Metatron also says that they are a species that no longer wish to be here, that they are unnatural in our environment. Most of the animals that are here now are here by choice, are here in one way or another of cooperation and pre-agreed harmony with humanity. But the Sasquatch and Yeti are not. They're remnants of the Dr. Moreau-esque experiments that took place in Atlantis. Does that make sense? There's a lot of speculations that I've read in certain magazines that the Yeti and Sasquatch are some sort of aliens or some sort of divine being, and they're not. They are the remnants, I believe, of that bioengineering, and I don't think they'll be here much longer. Metatron says that there are less than 1,000 of them on the planet. They're no longer reproducing, but they are remnants of that bioengineering. And it is the bioengineering that was one of the biggest conflicts between the sons of Belial. Did I get that right, John? Well, everybody says it's Belial, and that's what I said yesterday until I was at the home of Charles Cayce, and one of the persons of the A.R.E. introduced themselves as Belial. And and I think his name is Pat Belial, and he said, no, that's Belle-Isle in the French sense, and he said that the bad guys in the Atlantis story are not Belle-Isle, they are Belial. And so I want to clarify that. I learned that too, because that's what I used to call it. But we can call them the SOBs if you want. That would be, that might be an easier abbreviation. But the primary conflict between the children of the Law of One and the sons of Belial, who from this point will be the SB, was the genetic engineering. You had souls coming into the earth that were being entrapped in slave-like bodies that had genetic lobotomies. They could not express their intelligence, they could not express their emotions, and they were trapped in horrific bodies that they couldn't escape from. And this became a great, great source of the conflict between the children of the Law of One on Poseida and the people on the island of Arion. And so those timelines that I gave you before, after the second breakup, it was basically Poseida, Arion, and Og. And Arion was where the industrial complexes all existed. All of the great agricultural was controlled there, but it evolved into a caste society. It evolved into a class of the haves and the have-not. Does that sound familiar? And the people of Arion were becoming more and more intoxicated by the quantities of life, the luxuries of life, and there was an elite class. And in the early stages of the genetic engineering, a more perfected physical body had been made, and they called it the Aryan. And they had removed the tails, removed the feathers, all the fuzzy hair, all the things that they wanted removed that they considered impure, developed a body that they considered to be more consistent with the goals, and this was the Aryan. The one leverage that we had as the Poseidons was the control of the crystals. There was a sect on Poseida of scientist priests that Metatron refers to as the Atla-Ra. Some authors have suggested that the TUI was perhaps an abbreviation of something like NASA or something that stood for the group that managed the crystals. But the group in Atlantis on Poseida that handled the crystals were what Metatron refers to as that golden race, what Cayce refers to as the 12 feet tall. And so most of us, as you can imagine, were much bigger than we are now. Can you imagine 12 feet tall? And so speaking of life on Poseida, obviously there were a lot of big and tall shops that did really well. And but the Atla-Ra controlled the technology of the crystals. It was only initiates that knew how to manage them. And there were more types of crystals than just the one that is referred to as the terrible crystal. And so I want to show you, this is what I think it looked like after the first breakup. You can see that Og's a lot smaller, Poseida is considerably smaller, and this is probably even bigger than what it was. And there's Air and Atla. And of course, there was a lot of movement from the Atlanteans down to what Cayce called Oz or Og, which is present-day Peru. How many of you have been to Peru? How many of you have been to Bolivia? Bolivia is where I think Og or Oz existed. Tiahuanaco, which is actually in Bolivia, has been determined by some mainstream archaeologists to be at least 15,000 years old, using what they call the sun gate to align to a solstice that you have to move back in time 15,000 years. That would have certainly been at the time of Atlantis. And I think after the breakups, this remained one of the few areas, as well as Egypt, of where high technology remained. So after Atlantis finished, after the third breakup, I think there was a massive movement here, up into the United States as well, Central America, here, and in Africa. So very interesting in that sense. And after the second breakup, the islands were half the size of the ones that you see here. So I want to talk just a little bit about the crystal energy systems of Atlantis that I have received certain insights into that I'd like to share. The crystal stations were placed in pyramidal groupings, and they were triangulated. And these were for power use. Crystal temples that were spiritual were usually domed structures. And they were utterly beautiful, surrounded by lush gardens, statues, flowing fountains. A lot of thermal fountains were in the area of Poseidon. Still are certain thermals in areas that still remain there in the Caribbean areas. But it was a really, really wonderful place, not unlike the golden age of Greece and the Plaka with the Parthenon. And I believe that it was the Law of One Soul group that actually created the golden age of Greece. I think there's a lot of tie-ins between those. The stone that from this point forward I'm going to call the Firestone was ultimately, in my belief, an industrial crystal. Originally, it had certain uses where they used it to communicate with the infinite and for other spiritual purposes, but ultimately it became what we might want to call a industrial weapon as it fell into the hands of the Belial. There's one point that I'd like to mention here. Cayce reading 364:11 is really, really interesting. I'd like to read it to you. Then as both male and female, as those separations had begun, and the most ideal, as it would be called, was Adam, who was in that period when he appeared as 5 in 1, see, and that would indicate that he came into the 5 races, Cayce says, appeared at the same time. Then took on many sizes as to stature, from that may be called the midget to the giants, for there were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall as what we would term today 10 to 12 feet, and well proportioned. Now this is what is really interesting, or that caught my eye that wasn't common knowledge before. The ones that became the most useful were those that would be classified or called in the present as the ideal stature in this physiognomy was that of a full head with an extra eye. Cayce is saying that there was a body type there that had 3 eyes. And so is that a physical manifestation of the pineal? You know, the pineal gland is the gateway to our greater knowledge, to our ability to work in higher dimensions. The pineal gland actually has a corona, a retina, and I am wondering if that is actually a physical manifestation, because Cayce also spoke about certain crystals, certain alloys being invisible, not appearing in this plane. So is it possible that during certain stages of Atlantis, a human being at that time with 3 functional eyes was able to see and work in other dimensions more effectively than we are today? Is it possible that the 5th race that we're evolving into will acquire some of those attributes to be able to work in a greater number of dimensions than we have over the last 10,000 years? Is that possible? Do you think that's what he may be talking about?
Maybe it's all the psychics.
And possibly we all have that ability.
Yeah.
And that's going to be coming back, because one of the things that opens the pineal, according to what I believe, is the ionic ratio of the earth. How many have heard of Dr. Bernice Barlow? She wrote an incredible book that got very little notice called Sacred Sites of the West. And I've always had a great interest in sacred sites. And she wrote in her book that a study had been done in which they took ion generators. And they generated anionic beams, negative charges. And they shifted the background ratio of 6 negative to 1 positive, whereas normally it's 5 to 3. And that when it was shifted to 6 to 1, people began hallucinating. People began seeing things according to the university analysis that weren't there. They began having spiritual experiences, alien abductions. And she also noted that there are certain places on the earth that naturally have a 6 to 1 ratio of anions to cations, and that the Native Americans, campestral societies, and indigenous people had almost always chosen those places to be areas of vision and holy ground, sacred ground. 6 to 1, that shift. Now, the university said, see, all of this stuff is just chemical reaction in the brain. It's not real. I take the other position and say that it is that anionic to cationic ratio that opens the pineal gland. Because one of the things that I did in my spiritual search is I wanted to learn if it is possible to operate in other dimensions. And so for 7 years, I did vision quests. I found a facilitator, and I went to the West, and I had a Native American take me in a Lakota-type vision quest, only I was told that I had to do it for 5 days and not 3. Look at my body size. I didn't even get hungry for the first 3 days. But I went out 7 years in a row, and I had a job as a geologist and an engineer. The only time I'd get away was Christmas. And I'd save up enough vacation, and I'd leave and work my 5-day quest out to end on December 21st. Still get home for Christmas, but I also got the solstice, powerful day for my questing. First year I did it, 5 days, not much happened. I got away from the cell phone, lost some weight. Second year I went to a Yaqui reservation in Mexico. How many of you have heard of Carlos Castaneda, the Castaneda series? I went to a Yaqui reservation and I actually met Don Gennaro, who was mentioned in the book. And he was a bit of a strange guy and a little bit into witchcraft stuff, and it just met him at the end as a coincidence, so to speak. But well, let's put it this way. I lost a lot of weight. But nothing happened. I dealt with a lot of sandstorms. The third year, I went back to Arizona, and I went to a place called Shaman's Dome that I've written about. And I'm laying there 3 days, no food, no water. I would go the first 3 days with no water, and the entire 5 days with no food. And I would get a cup of tea or something the fourth and fifth days. And on the fourth day of the third year, I was starting to get really frustrated. What am I doing taking vacation, my age, laying out here on the cold ground? Nothing's happening. And it snowed that night. This is a place near Sedona, and it was December, and we got about 4 inches of snow, and it was really a long night. And I woke up in the morning looking for the guide to come. He was supposed to be bringing me some hot tea. And I was glad the light was coming in. And I set up on my sleeping bag and looked to my side, and there was a Native American sitting there. Of course, I'm seeing him in what may be referred to as a hallucination, but he didn't disappear. First thought I had was, my God, I'm having a vision. And I was. And I closed my eyes, opened my eyes, and he was still there. And we had some communication back and forth. It was meaningful for me. And it was really powerful for me because I was seeing lucidly through this extra eye. And it was a world that I could navigate in that made sense to me. There was somebody there communicating, and he wasn't disappearing. And he told me to walk with him a certain distance, and I did, and I was still seeing him. And then he disappeared. I went up on top of this place called Shaman's Dome, and I had an out-of-body experience. And I flew over the valley, and I actually saw Yellowbird's old trip pickup starting to drive along. And as if he recognized me, he pulled over and began singing the vision song. And he was a couple miles from where I was. And so that was a powerful experience for me, because I proved to myself that this third eye can work and through a natural means. And it was very powerful because those other dimensions were real. I actually had the experience of flying over that body, seeing people wake up in the morning going to their cars, Yellowbird's old pickup coming up there. And so it changed my perspective quite a lot. It was a shift for me. And I did those vision quests 2 more years in that modality. And the next year that I did it was on top of the San Francisco peaks. And I had similar experiences of extraterrestrials. And I'll be the first to tell you that such experiences perhaps are hallucinations. But there was a navigation to it. There was a lucidity toward it. I don't want to take on the academic argument of convincing somebody else that my experience was real. I will say it was valid for me, and that I was able to navigate within it. I was able to have conversations that were real within it. And that was a quantum leap for me, as I think it is for anyone that seeks. I did not achieve anything that anyone here is incapable of. You were talking about psychics in that third eye. We all have that ability. You all have that ability. It simply takes the effort. And so I'm believing that the children of the Law of One of Atlantis at that time absolutely had that third eye. I don't know if he means that that was physically there or if he generalizes in a lot of these terms. Edgar Cayce was a magnificent person. He read the Bible every year of his life. When you channel, a lot of your belief system comes through the conscious mind. It has to. And so he wrote in biblical vernacular because much of his conscious mind was based in that faith that he had gotten from the Bible. And I will say this, my life, I spent 33 years as a foreigner outside the United States. I lived in Africa for 6 years. I went through 3 coups d'etats. My wife and I got rescued by the French Foreign Legion in a situation where the entire town was burnt down. I know what it's like to know fear. And I know what it's like to be a foreigner. And I was forced to learn how to read people by looking at their eyes. And to get a sense, because part of my problem was I always looked like an American. And if there was ever an issue, I knew I'd be the first hostage. And so you learn when you're outside your comfort zone how to communicate in different ways. I never watched television. I had to learn the languages of the countries that I was in. I speak Spanish, Portuguese, and French, not because I studied it, but because I lived there and I had to. And while in these countries, I was in South America 9 years, Middle East for a number of years, Russia, Africa again for 6, I didn't watch television. I came home once a year and I bought Edgar Cayce books. At one time I had read every book that the A.R.E. sold, and I would come home with that big suitcase, and it wasn't exactly that was a great attribute on my character. It was just, there was no TV to watch, and I was fascinated by this work, so I studied metaphysics in that way, and really became familiar with a lot of the teachings of Cayce. And then after Cayce, I got into other things like the Jane Roberts books, the Lobsang Rama books, you name them. And I would read it. I studied Buddhism, I studied the Quran, I studied everything that I could get my hands on. I had a hunger to understand about what our purpose for life is. But I'll tell you this, of all the books that I read, of all the studies, of all the directions that I went into, it is the work of Edgar Cayce that always brings me back to a sense of the Christ energy. Whether you want to read the metaphysical books that are scientific in nature, and I've read them all with a hunger. It is when you come back to this that you get a sense of the Christos energy, a sense of the spirituality aspect. There are some fascinating books that talk about multidimensionality, extraterrestrials. But it is the Cayce work that always centers me and brings me back to some sort of understanding of the importance of love and compassion. I suggest much of the experiences that we had in Atlantis at that time as part of the law of one, we had that third eye. We operated in 12 dimensions. I also suggest to you that we're going to get that ability back because of the coronal mass ejections that are taking place that has shifted the planet back into a 6:1 ratio. Susan Joy Renison and others talk about jet streams of plasma circulating the Earth right now that are pure anionic energy from coronal mass ejections. You know what those are: solar storms, solar winds. We've had billions and billions and billions of tons of anionic energy coming to the planet since '89. It's like the Cambrian explosion. It's changing things. And so with that anionic shift, which opens the pineal, I believe, and with the knowledge of what happens in the theta vibration, which I'll talk about in my next presentation, we have the ability to operate in other dimensions. Okay, we've got time for this. So I want to tell you how I think that the end of Atlantis came. This is Setchi Sadaji's. I think this is one of the crystal stations that crashed in Atlantis, and I'm going to tell you how I think it crashed. Cayce talks about that great crystal receiving the rays of the sun going through a prism. I suggest to you that there was a second moon of Atlantis, that there was a massive crystalline satellite that had an anti-gravity belt that circulated around it, and it moved auto-regulated, that it was Arcturian, Syrian, Palladian engineering construct, and that the great crystal shifted up to it, and that it beamed in. It was capable of putting in energy around agriculture to make it grow faster. It was capable of calming the tides, of controlling the weather to a certain degree, and all sorts of amazing things. It was the tool that controlled these vibes that were run out, and the airplanes were able to fly, picking up off of those energies. Now, Cayce says that the Firestone was 6-sided. You've all read that. You heard John talk about it. I speculate that it was about 10 meters in height, 32 feet, and it was about 4 meters wide. Now, he said it was capable of emitting gravity waves. Well, then that's interesting. And in searching the internet, R.F. Hutton, who has spoken here, found an article by Dr. Ray Mallett that has surmised a way in which quartz crystal can have a laser orbiting around it in a rectangular field on a hexagonal base and exude gravity waves. Quartz crystals can exude gravity waves, and that is what Cayce said was used. So we are getting close to that technology that they had in those days. So I'm going to tell you what I think was the end of Atlantis. The Aryans had perfected a body type. They controlled all the agriculture, all the money, and all the military. A charismatic leader rose up in Aryan, and he built a sense of pride. He taught them that they were a master race and that it was their place to lead the world. And this man was Hitler, and it was Himmler. And in fact, the Aryans have resurfaced in 2 other wars. World War II was a battle of the Aryans and the Atlanteans in a sense, but there was another one, and it was the Spanish Inquisition. That same energy rose up again. And they were having the desire to take over parts of Greece, but they couldn't get the Poseidons to let them have that great crystal, that weapon. But they knew the Poseidons were horrified at the genetic engineering. So the Aryans came up with a clever compromise. They said, let's set up a governing council. 4 people from Aryan, 5 people from Poseida. We can do that. And if the council decides to stop the genetic engineering, we'll stop it. And in return, you train a few of our people on how to operate these crystals. A lot of them had doubts about it, including Tyberonn, who was one of the Pleiadians that was there, and they finally agreed to it. And for centuries it worked. They stopped the genetic engineering, and then in time they had, remember, people were living thousands of years then. They had enough people to take over the crystal controls, and Cayce has numerous readings, which I have in this presentation, where he talks about people originally being with the law of one and becoming seduced by power to go to the other side. There must be 10 readings in which Cayce gives for people. He said that you started out with the law of one, you had the crystal technology, and for your own advancement, you shifted sides. I can reference you the numbers after this if you want to see them, they're there. The Aryans seduced enough of the technologists to come across, and they brought one of the Poseidons over to their side on the basis that we need to quell these riots and we need to use this. And so they used this crystal satellite to create earthquakes. It began shifting, they didn't stop, and it was that satellite crashing that melted the quartz strata of the earth, and it was the end of Atlantis. That was the sad end of Atlantis. It is the crashing of the second moon. What did we learn from Atlantis? We carry that guilt, not because we were necessarily part of the Aryans, but because we didn't stop it. We got duped. What do we learn? One of the things that we have to learn is that we can't put our heads in the sand. So I'm going to end this presentation now. I think it's time, and we'll stay on schedule. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
From her western shores, those beautiful sailors journeyed to the South and the North Americas with ease, in their ships with painted sail. To the east, Africa was a neighbor, across a short strait of sea miles. The great Egyptian age is but a remnant of the Atlantean culture.
Like a child who's running wild.
Antediluvian kings colonized the world. All the gods who play in the mythological dramas, in all legends from all lands, were from fair Atlantis. Knowing her fate, Atlantis sent out ships to all corners of the earth. On board were the 12, the poet, the physician, the farmer, the scientist, the magician, and the other so-called gods of our legends. Though gods they were, and as the elders of our time to remain blind. Let us rejoice, sing, dance, and ring in the new age. Hail Atlantis!
Like a child who's running wild, sinking deeper down the line. I close my eyes to see the light. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be. Way down below the ocean, way down, where I wanna be, she may be. Like a child who's running wild, sinking deeper down the line. I close my eyes to see the light. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be.
My antediluvian baby. I wanna see you someday. I wanna see you someday. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, way down
Below the ocean,
the ocean.
where